Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth talk in the series Academia in the Wild, and final in this series of Academia in the Wild. And I'm very pleased to say hi to our today's speaker, Professor Sara Czerny. Academia in the Wild, as you already know, is a program by Center for Advanced Studies Southeast Europe of University of Rijeka, which investigates through a series of talks the transformation of university in 21st century, and especially specifically with regards to the relations between the university and the community. So I wouldn't take up much of our time, and I would leave the floor to Professor Sara Czerny for her talk, which we're very, very pleased to have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak about what I'd like to speak about today, because it's something I'm working on. So I'm really glad to hear your comments are going to be really helpful to me. So thank you very much. What I want to talk today about is the role of, let's call it science at the moment, in raw milk drinking. But as I will say, and hopefully you will see, there are lots of parallels. It's not just about raw milk drinking. So it's about perhaps the wider issues. But I'm going to look at them through the context of raw milk drinking. And I've got some slides now. Can I share? Hopefully I can share without.
Yeah, you should be able to share.
I should, let me just put on the slideshow. 1 second. Share screen. Okay. Share.
Oh,
excellent. Do you see?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, I will make it into a slideshow. So here we go. Okay. So yeah, it's looking at the motivations into research. Basically, the title I hope will be become clearer as we talk about it. But just to give a very brief background just into my research for people who I haven't bothered with it about it. It's research on interspecies milk relations. So basically, I have been looking at how we produce milk, humans, donkeys, cows, sheep and goats, looking at different ways of doing this, how we construct what are humans, what are donkeys, what are cows. So that's been my main interest, and it's just finished turning into a manuscript, and now hopefully will be published. So that's over, that phase. But my main interest, or my deepest interest in all of this, has always been in human microbial relations, how we relate basically to microbes, who are obviously now becoming very important in our lives again. What's interesting, or what I found interesting, and what started my interest, which is related to what I'm going to talk about today, is that other scholars as well who've been working on this area about social aspects of microbes have said that there are very determined narratives about microbes in a negative way. So people are talking about microbes being negative, and there's a very determined, almost you could say dogmatic approach towards microbes, that they're things that need to be destroyed, we're at war with them. Always the best example is just to go look in a supermarket and you can see all the different materials there are to destroy microbes. And some researchers, Myra Hurd, Heather Paxson, have said that we've got to think about them not in that way, but see more of a sort of balanced perspective on microbes. So that's what's been interesting to me. And one group of people who were in my research, or who I met in my research, who I've termed the apasturians, it's related to a kind of evolutionary idea that people who don't know about the presence of microbes are often considered as being backward or less advanced than people who are worried about microbes. So that's why I've given them that title. But these people who I met in my research, and there were quite a few, were drinking raw milk. raw unpasteurized milk. They were drinking it from either going straight to the farms and buying milk directly from farmers, or they were going to milk vending machines. I'm sure you've seen some, but they're around. We have them around Rijeka as well. Milk vending machines, and they aren't what they would call cooking the milk. They're not boiling it. So it's drinking it absolutely as it is in the vending machine. When I asked them, you know, what was their motivations for doing this, they said that it was because they thought it was healthier. When you heat milk up in the pasteurization process, its goodness is lost, vitamins are lost, that this was the best way to drink it. So they had those kind of commentaries, and also that they've been drinking this milk, or their families have been drinking milk. Very often we'd hear stories about how their parents or grandparents used to drink milk when it was still warm from the cow, it was never heated up. So there was a sort of tradition of drinking raw milk. So that was their perspective. But at the same time, in my research, because I was looking at so many, or visiting so many different people, I was also speaking with microbiologists and people working in immunology, in researchers on milk production at the Faculty of Agriculture in Zagreb as well, who absolutely say this is incredibly risky behavior. This is an incredibly risky practice, because you can basically get microbes, unwanted microbes. You can ingest unwanted microbes. And the research from these researchers shows this. Mikulits and others have just done research, but there's been previous research on this, on milk vending machines, where out of 28 vending machines that they followed and they were testing microbiologically, 17 had pathogenic bacteria species in them. So there's a risk. And those are the folk who they found in the milk. None of them you would really want to ingest. They all cause you troubles in some shape or form. So there is an apparent risk in drinking this, and it's not a risk that is made up. They've, through their laboratories, shown it. So they see this issue of drinking raw milk as a problem. And then for me, as an anthropologist following it and seeing these two sides, throughout my research, throughout writing the book, writing articles on apasturians, there was this always question of why. Why, if the scientific evidence is saying and showing that there is this real risk of drinking raw milk, why do people do that? What's going on there to stop them from taking this scientific knowledge on board? And that was a question which I, all the way through, and I must say, it really bothered me, but I didn't dig into it. I didn't unpack it. So I've been unpacking it now for this talk. So I'm really grateful, because I found what was bothering me. So this is the question of why. Why do people do that? So we can start to look a bit wider, and Mead and Schaffer just now in August, I think it came out, in Public Understanding of Science, have said or talked about the need to start talking about science-related populism. So Caspar Murta and his very famous sort of attempt to define populism or describe populism as the people versus the elite. They've taken that and then talked about it in terms of science, about the academic elite. So they've talked about this relation coming up that we need to talk about and we need to think about more. The two forms of knowledge that are sort of set in contrast to one another is the academic abstract knowledge versus common sense practical knowledge, which is something that they take from Sarit and Gunster, who've written a very interesting article about also a form of science-related populism on radio talk shows. One thing that Sarit and Gunster say, which actually struck me really when I was reading them, is that very much of the research we take or do on populist movements is on social media. And actually the radio is a very important sphere that should be explored because people are constantly listening to the radio. So that was something that just an aside. So what they say is that in this relation, in this contradictory or juxtaposition between these two forms of knowledge, there's a moralizing occurring whereby people see common sense and experience as being morally superior to academic knowledge. The abstraction process of academic knowledge is seen as a space where interests sleep in and basically daily life is disregarded. So there's a juxtaposition between academic knowledge and common sense practical knowledge, and it's those two poles or polarities which creates this distinction between what Milan Schaeffer called the ordinary people and academic elite. So this is, they've just put this out, if you like, so this is something that they've just wanted to basically start a conversation about. When we think about that, or when I thought about that in terms of the more raw milk drinkers I met, is this a kind of form of populism involved? And Milan Schaeffer said themselves, which is really important, that there's so many forms which aren't science-related populism, so they're not trying to put everything under the same umbrella. And yes, these experiences people say about their parents or grandparents drinking raw milk and not being ill does seem to be that there is this sort of tension between everyday experience and scientific knowledge. But actually, if there's a problematic figure in their narratives, it's not the academic, it's not the scientist, it's the European Union. They see the European Union as being the person who's causing them troubles. So there's a really good film, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, it's good to see, Série Vrchně, which was made in 2013, which is discussing the experiences of people at the market in Zagreb about how the new European laws will affect their production. So that's a really good film. So it's difficult to say that this raw milk drinking is some kind of populist activity or anything to do with populism in the sense that, say, Kasper Mutter and others have talked about. But that still doesn't solve or resolve the question of why. Why are people still doing this? And this is where we can, I think, really see today. I was looking at the news and Mr. Trump is whipping off his mask again. Anti-vaccination, also another area. Is this all part of what we could say is a general trend towards some kind of anti-science? This raw milk drinking, ignoring science, what's going on here? So that's a question that I've asked, and I've asked it through the anti-vaccination literature. The reason why I do this is because there's not that much written about why people drink raw milk, and it's from the social sciences or humanities perspective, but also because the anti-vaccination literature has really, there's a huge amount written about why people don't vaccinate, or more often why they don't vaccinate their children. So this is a really rich vein that we can look at. There's one thing which at the end you'll see why is very relevant, one very important. I mean, there's lots of differences, so I'm not trying to put all of these different practices in the same basket, but one important difference is what's very interesting with anti-vaccination or vaccination issue is the fact that this is it's social effect, if we like, or social relations surrounding. If you drink raw milk, you will probably poison yourself and possibly people in your family. So it's a smaller sphere of trouble. If you don't vaccinate, obviously there's a huge social issue there with the idea of herd immunity and all these things. So it's a more social, I would say that not vaccinating or vaccinating is a more social activity than perhaps drinking raw milk in the sense of the number of people who are involved. And that's really important for later on. So that's just to say as an aside. So when we go to the anti-vaccination literature, one thing that pops out, I'm talking about this sort of from the perspective that probably this might be a relatively new body of literature for you. Anti-vaxxers, the actual anti-vaxxers that are often presented in the news portals or newspapers or on radio are actually a very small minority. It's a very broad spectrum. So it's not like there's a huge number of anti-vaxxers who are absolutely against vaccination. No, there's a lot of very many people who are what often are called the undecideds. We can talk about vaccine refusal and we can talk about vaccine hesitation. And especially in terms of vaccinating children, what comes up very often is that perhaps parents may vaccinate one type of vaccination. They may, for example, the MMR, which is often the one that's most talked about or often been researched because that's one had perhaps most attention. They might not vaccinate in the combined three, but they might vaccinate separately. So we can't, when we talk about anti-vaxxers, it's actually pretty derogatory and it's a very, very small number of people. Most people are undecided and not quite sure what they want to do. Jennifer Reich, has written a wonderful book, really, really good book. And what makes me really hopeful is that she's actually got lots of awards for it. So that's a very positive step. Has actually made a really important point, again, you'll see that later, is that actually missed appointments and lack of access is the bigger reason in the United States for non-vaccination than vaccine refusal. And that's really, really important. You'll see, hopefully, why in a moment. But it's a really, really vital point that we think about why people aren't getting to their appointments and lack of access. But we spend a lot of time talking about vaccine refusal. So we'll talk about that in a minute. When you look at that vast body of literature, and it's huge because it's from all sorts of different perspectives, all different disciplines are involved, psychology, anthropology, sociology, medicine in all its different branches have all looked at this. And it's really difficult to actually make a nice kind of picture of that body of literature. But there's certain areas in the social sort of people who are researching it from the social side, social relations, which you can see. For example, a lot of scholars are looking at the role of the internet, Facebook, they're looking particularly at Facebook in vaccine refusal, vaccine hesitation. Scholars are taking also historical research because vaccine refusal, vaccine hesitation has a long history and it's not something that's new, so that's important. Very many stress the social context, the importance of exploring the social context. Eliza Sob has written a lovely article about vaccine refusal and vaccine hesitation with Waldorf parents of children who attend Waldorf schools in the United States, where she talks about the concept of refusal. She actually problematizes the concept of refusal, which for those who are interested in rejection is maybe a really interesting article, because as she says, refusing something is not always, we shouldn't always see it as a negative act. It's actually to elicit your belonging to a group, it can be. So for Waldorf parents, refusing to vaccinate their child actually confirms their belonging to that group of people. So that's really interesting. So she's she really problematizes the concept of refusal. Most of these authors come up with the point that this idea that people who don't vaccinate their children or themselves are ignorant or deficit in some way, it's a problematic approach. It's far more complex than that. And this is an important point because of the fact that we or have been in scientific literature saying that what we should be doing is to explain the benefits of vaccination better, and that will make everyone want to vaccinate. And they're saying, no, that's not the case. It's much more than that. So we've got to think about that. And they also talk about dialogue, which is also really important. We've got to have a dialogue. We can't just lecture people about what's going on. So it's a very heterogeneous body of research, and as I say, from all sorts of different disciplines, it's really difficult to try and make a nice map of it. So I'm afraid I haven't, but there are different areas. But one thing that I found when I was watching this literature, like almost as an anthropologist, well, as an anthropologist, was that there is this very shared idea that we're all doing this because we want to understand. So we're understanding, and you don't have to read through all these citations. I just wanted to see how this verb understand pops up, understand, awareness. So we're understanding these resistance. And it really is striking when you start to see it. And when I was looking through understand, it popped up in almost every text from all these different perspectives. So the reason why people are doing internet or looking at internet or social media or smallpox histories is because they want to understand better. And the reason why they say they want to understand better is because they want to find good interventions. So we're looking for the reasons to understand. And Navin and I'll say most specifically, there's different interventions for different refusal groups. If you go back just here, we can say how these attitudes may be effectively countered. It's crucial to understand the parents, allow for better communication, convert audiences to stop them being converted. So there is this very strong impression in this body of literature that the reason why this research is occurring is to understand why people are not vaccinating or refusing or hesitant or whatever, so that we can then find a better way to persuade them to vaccinate. And the sort of end product, if you like, which I think we can see in the World Health Organization, is all this knowledge that people are collecting about why people don't vaccinate or hesitant, then is then we would expect or could expect, is then moved into policy. So we've got this best practice, how to respond to vocal vaccine deniers in public. And when you start to look at this, it's how to respond, and the suggestions are based on psychological research on persuasion, research in public health, communication studies on World Health Organization risk communication guidelines. So for me, you may not agree, but I see quite a sort of neat steps going from doing the research. The motivation for doing the research is so we can understand. The motivation for understanding is to try and change people's minds, which is then being filtered into policy. So let's think about that just for a bit more a moment. Because I see problems. I see huge problems with this, really huge ones. And I see them in different levels and in different ways. It seems to me, and I know I'm, sort of putting it into a small nutshell and it's perhaps making it a bit simplistic, but this research is basically to try and persuade people to change their minds. I mean, that seems to be the effect. And we've got issues which, and I put NB, the categories are not neat. They don't blend into each other. They do blend into each other. Sorry. They're not neat categories. So you can see that they're all connected, but I've just put them in this way so it's easier to present. So the first issue, for me as a social anthropologist, sorry, I didn't say that, is ethical. We've got a really huge ethical question here, which I think really needs to be discussed. Now, I'm really not very keen on the whole moralizing that often scholars like to do. So I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to do is say that we need to talk about it. And I don't see in that literature a conversation going on. There's very diplomatic conversation people are trying to start. Jennifer Reich in her account, very good. But we need to talk about the ethics of this. In every anthropological ethical codex, which I know is guidelines and not rules, but they're there to help us, are talking about preserving or protecting the integrity and dignity of the people we're working with. Intrusion, both the Association of Anthropologists in the UK and Commonwealth and in the American both talk about dignity and about not intruding into people's private and personal domains. They talk about, especially the American Anthropological, about the most serious harms being those that seek to avoid harm to dignity. So we need to really think about that research that we're doing on people to change their minds. How does this relate to their, what harms are we doing? We need to think about it. Really, really important. It's really important. The counter argument, I guess, which is when I was thinking about it, is that yes, but we're talking about the greater good. And that's where the sociality of vaccine refusal or hesitation becomes important in comparison to raw milk. Because yes, it's for other people as well. We are we're talking about other people who don't vaccinate or refuse or hesitate to vaccinate, or they've got the herd immunity. So perhaps for the greater good, actually, it is sort of preserving bodily and material well-being. But any anthropological codex, from what I see, is always saying that your first obligation, there's always going to be interests, different interests, and your first obligation is always going to be towards the people you're researching. So if you're doing research on people who are questioning vaccination or hesitant or refusing to do so, you're actually, as an anthropologist, and I'm talking very specifically as an anthropologist, your first obligation is towards them, not to the greater good. And that's set out in the ethical codexes. I was looking at them again, and it's really clear there who your first interest is, because all research has conflict of interest in some shape or form. So I'm not saying, I don't want to get into a moralizing high horse or any of this, but I think that we need to talk about that. We need to take to think about that and to talk about how does that perhaps we need to be a bit clearer about the ethics of this situation, that we're doing research on people to change their minds. This is really, really important. The second is this analytical issue between us and them. Which is set up in this relation. If we're doing research on them, the people who don't vaccinate or are hesitant, we have in a way aligned ourselves with scientific research. We've made an almost, there's an analytical move there. We've become associated with scientific research, scientific knowledge. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that has, in my mind, a potential to possibly feed science-related populism, in the sense that that division is being set up in our analytical work, in our analytical move of putting us in the same category as scientific researchers, as people asking, why do they not do that? We are actually creating a division or eliciting a division, which could then be employed or could help to feed what others are saying is particularly important at the present time, is the possibility of certain figures perhaps using this division for their political, let's say, interests. Bloom has said something similar in 2006 about that this kind of research unites public health and medical professionals behind the banner of reasonable morality. So there's that elliptical move. And also the other thing is, are we putting ourselves as social scientists or people working in humanities as defenders of science? Is that our role? So that's a question. I don't have the answers. I just want to ask. It's raised lots of questions for me. And that then started to make me think about Jennifer Wright's comment that actually the largest number of, or the largest reason, or one of the most important reasons why there is vaccine in the United States, refusal or hesitation, is actually because of missed appointments and limited access. So why are we spending so much time? It seems there seems to be a sort of inflated amount of time spent on vaccine refusal, vaccine hesitation. Are we doing this because it's a challenge to science? Again, provocative. I mean, it's quite, yeah, we need to ask these questions. So is this research where we are basically, just to go back, looking at different interventions for different refusal groups, are we doing this as a kind of scientific activism? Is this scientific? These are questions again, all question marks. Is this a form of scientific activism, or is this scientific research? There's a lot of research about disciplinarity within anthropology. Annelies Riles, Iris John Klein have written about talking about it. We've got lots and lots of work, again, on engagement studies and engagement within anthropology. Again, we don't have to have a fixed answer, everyone the same. People have got different opinions, different ideas. Again, the literature tells us it's a spectrum, but that's another thing we need to think about when we're asking these questions. And the third issue is a methodological one. And this one is important because of the ethnographic relation. The ethnographic relation, if it's started off as just for you are doing your field work, you're going out, is normally quite a singular relation. And that actually makes life a lot easier. Because Boyer has written a very interesting article about researching of experts. He says that actually researching scientists is demanding. It's very demanding because you very often have another relation going on at the same time. So rather than it being a singular relation as it is in, for example, usual, let's say, ethnographic relations, you've got two relations in a sense going on. And I've seen that with my own, in my own research. Very quickly, these relations with scientists or people working in, say, microbiologists or turn into very collegial relations. Because you are sharing knowledge. Very often these conversations are talking about articles, or we could do a project together. Oh, yeah, that's interesting because we're perhaps working interdisciplinary. And they become very collegial forms of exchange, what Boyer calls a politics of respectful distance. So in a sense, you automatically, it's very difficult. I mean, I'm sure the anthropologists about ethnographic relations are seriously demanding relations at the best of times. And this adds another dimension to it because you're automatically sort of torn or pushed towards being on the side of scientific research because you're talking about similar, and you get into that, what I would say, form of collegial relating with each other. And it's very difficult, and that's what Boyer also says in his article, to then start to get into the sort of worldview of someone. So you're at a very formal meeting like this. It would be like now, our conversation like now, which is, I would say, a collegial form of relating. And then somebody questions to say to me, oh, so what did you do at the weekend? It's getting out of a framework that we've kind of all slip into. It's familiar to us. So that's one problem. On the other hand, these ethnographic relations with people who are very possibly working at the same university as you, working in a similar social context, you could even find, which I have, you found each other sitting at the same meetings. It's very often, it's very easy for these relations to become almost friendships, which is incredibly problematic because of the ethnographic relation. So again, the minute that relation slips into some kind of friendship, ethnographic relation is dead for me. I mean, that's my perspective, because you can't then use that material that you've had from those conversations in your articles. It's just blurring too many boundaries and making, I would say, some quite serious issues. So basically, methodologically, we are pushed into that collegiality. We are pushed into basically the side of scientists and scientific research, which is something, again, to really, really think about when we're talking about these things. So that was my sort of forage into the literature on anti-vaccination and vaccine or vaccine refusal and vaccine hesitancy. And what comes out of that is that the issue of why do people drink raw milk is actually bothersome, or the question is bothersome, because it's just not a good question. Because the minute you ask that question about why are they doing this, you've set yourself into a particular position. And it's so easy to slip into it. So in fact, it's not because, I thought at the beginning it was because, oh, I don't know, you know, the answer, what's the answer? Or I don't know how to go about answering it. But actually, no, after a lot of thought, and really a lot of thought, it boils down, it seems to me, that this is actually a pretty bad question to ask. Because of the fact that by asking it, you've instantly aligned yourself in all these different ways. Because you're trying to ask, why are they doing this? The minute you asking why someone's doing this, then it's like it's something which is unusual, or you need to find an explanation for. So what do we do with it? And now I'll wrap up, because I'd really like to hear all you say. Do we balance it or do we abandon it? The literature, as I say, talks about dialogue. So do we talk about why do people want to drink raw milk, and also why people don't want to drink it? Latour offers, as he tries in his texts, especially on pasteurization, about forces. Do we then abandon this idea of scientific knowledge and non-scientific knowledge and talk about these different forces, which is a possibility? If we ask both sides of the coin, we actually then extricate ourselves from being aligned with science. So that seems to me quite a possibility. If we want to, I'm still not decided. I think perhaps it's better just to abandon the question altogether. But at least if we ask both sides, then we are taking a third position. Now we've got Levi-Strauss, all of our rules and cooks and mediators, but we can take a third position. So we're not aligned so quickly with science. It gives us a bit of an analytical distance. But one thing that was really interesting to me is, okay, here we're talking about raw milk. And as I say, raw milk drinking raw milk as a practice is perhaps less, since it's perhaps not such a social activity. Of course, you can infect others, but it's perhaps not in the same sense, or as in terms of vaccination. Basically, when the interest in vaccination, and we've got it now, we've got it not just about vaccination, but about wearing masks these days. There is much interest in these fields, much more than there is about drinking raw milk. There is never a headline about why do people drink raw milk on any news portal, but there are about vaccination, and now particularly about mask wearing with COVID-19. But one thing that I found really interesting is that when you go back to this research, and this is the last slide, is when you go back to the research or think about it, the research is asking, why do people not vaccinate? But we very rarely get the question of, why do people vaccinate? That question's not asked. And that seems to me like a very, in a sense, interesting absence, at least in the anthropological literature. It's not asked. We're focusing on why people don't vaccinate or why they're hesitant to do so, but we don't have a book about why people are vaccinating. And I think that that could be really interesting in sense of how does that, what's the difference? And that's where we get scientific knowledge. We can see how is it that people are vaccinating. I know, again, in every text, it seems that it's almost a, not obligation, but people express their position on it because their personal position. But my child's vaccinated and at all stages, and there's never been any sort of, question mark about it. But actually sitting down and saying, well, why do I do that is actually, or why do we do that is really sort of, you would think, important question to ask in that sense. How is it that scientific knowledge or reliance on scientific knowledge to actually do that? How does that actually work? So I think that could be a really interesting area to explore. I'm not saying, because as I say, I'm a visitor into the literature on vaccination, so I don't want to present myself as any form of expert on that corpus of literature. I'm borrowing that body of literature for my interest on consumption of raw milk, but it's an extremely fertile area to think about these questions, and actually has been really, really helpful. So it's definitely, there's lots of questions there that we could ask. So basically, to sum up after everything I've said, the question of why people do drink raw milk, I feel should be, at least I will on my side, be abandoned. But the problems of that question absolutely need to be explored. I think there's lots and lots of things there that we really need to talk about. The literature on vaccine hesitation, vaccine refusal, from what I've read, are all talking about the need for dialogue. They're all talking about, we mustn't embed ourselves and sort of beat people on the head with our texts, because that's not going to do anything. We need to get into more dialogue. So absolutely, they're saying that there's an issue. It's not that they're not saying that. And again, Jennifer Wright's book, really good. She has suggestions about how that could be going about, but in terms of a dialogue rather than persuading people to vaccinate, which is a very big difference. And the last thing is, which is what she says, which is related to vaccination, but I think we can say about raw milk drinking, is that these practices have been going on for a very, very long time, and it's not going to change. It's not going to change overnight. So we really, really need to think about it, perhaps from a different perspective. And that's all I would say. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this extremely thought-provoking talk. So I would first like to ask if somebody has a question or a comment, perhaps immediately. Christina. Yes, if I'm not. Yeah.
Okay. Sarah, thank you so much. This was very interesting, and to me, I mean, it's I really like your perspective of and I would say from a psychological point of view, empathically looking into the reasons and the rationale behind some behavior. You know, this is, I mean, related to the ethical point, like how do we treat people if we are intended to go there and get information in order to change their mind, you know? Yeah, so I mean, this really resembles me to the methodology of psychotherapy, of how the psychotherapeutic relation is built upon, and how, I mean, the only way the change is made is through an okay position, you know, like a respectful position towards one thinking and reasoning. And I was not looking into particularly this question, but in Project Cultures of Rejection, we are dealing with the questions of why people reject and whom do they reject. And some of those rejected things or subjects are elites. So either government elites or scientific elites, you know, so to me, this is a very similar, actually a very similar topic. And what I see somewhere there is that this is a question of trust. Trust towards the authority, which is somewhat dictating influencing our lives. So when that trust is more seriously damaged, then people are prone to reject more and more things coming from, you know. So when I look at I mean people who are rejecting or non-rejecting, like I have this impression this is not a question of having information, of researching or of knowing things. It is a question about trust in experts.
Yeah, absolutely, because now you've reminded me something so important, which is vital, and I think absolutely confirms what you're saying about trust. Is whilst I was thinking about this, why people drink raw milk without boiling it or heating it, obviously the vaccination, it's something that rings sort of parallels with me, and I was looking at one parents group. I think they're parents, it's not about vaccinating themselves, it's about vaccinating their children, about anti, so they're against vaccination, and a lot of the material that they share is scientific articles about the dangers of vaccination or what somebody said, that kind of material. And then something that probably struck me, because I have master's thesis students, was a master's thesis student asking whether they would like to, it was on Facebook, whether they would like to participate in some research on why people don't vaccinate. And she'd really asked it beautifully. I remember reading it thinking, oh, you know, this is the best way. She's explained everything nicely, all the ethics of everything was right. So it wasn't a sort of half-hearted request. She'd really nicely laid it out, explaining where she was doing her research, who her supervisor was, everything. The comments underneath really, I must say, shocked me at first, because you kind of have that naive view that research is all right. Was no way, no, we don't want you, no chance, absolute refusal. And the reason being is you're going to make idiots of us. You always make us look like we're mad. You make us in your research absolute look like the biggest fools on the planet. And this comment, and I realized there was such a lack of trust in the scientific process, that this wasn't a neutral process. You are researching us to make us look bad. You are researching us to prove your point that we're all cranks and whatever. And then I thought, wow, that trust in this, and that's what shocked me, because I kind of had that naive belief. People have absolutely no trust whatsoever in the scientific process. Absolutely none whatsoever, according to those comments. Okay, it was one anecdote, one situation, but it really made me stop and think, okay, something's really wrong here. And that's not just coming from some populist, if you like, dialogue. There's something going on wrong with us as people doing research and the people who we do research. That trust has been broken pretty badly in that sense. So that's really absolutely, I would say that trust is absolutely, because it's all of these, especially in this sense, trusting not to vaccinate or to vaccinate. To vaccinate, you have to have trust. There has to be trust involved. And to not vaccinate, there has to be trust. And whose knowledge are you trusting? I mean, at the end, I would say, is so important to look at that. So yeah, absolutely, really important. Fundamental, really, the concept of trust. And what you were saying about the psychotherapeutic relation, this is something which I think, as an anthropologist doing research, we anthropologists rely on our relation with our informants, if we're going to call them. There's debate about how to name the people we research with. So, okay, just for speed's sake, we'll say informant now, though I have some issues with that term. But our tool is our relation, and we love to talk about other people's relations as anthropologists. We're not so good at our own, and we need to think about that relation much more carefully and much more deeply, and think about it. We talk about ethics, and that's nice to lean on an ethics code when we're in trouble. We know, okay, this gives us a guide, but actually how we build those relations, how we nurture them. Ethnographic relation, if it's working as it should, is a really demanding, heavy relation. Not heavy in a bad way, but you have got so many things to be thinking about, you as the anthropologist in that relation. And we don't talk about that. We talk about it from a theoretical sense, but we don't talk about it from a perhaps practical, methodological sense. And that's where I think psychotherapy is very useful for anthropologists, because not because we're doing this, not a therapeutic relation in any sense or form, but how psychotherapists nurture and think about their relations. I think anthropologists could be encouraged by that, to think about those relations.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you were saying about methodological questions, that really like, and about this collegial relation and this kind of a distance that is created. This is the exact same reason why psychotherapy cannot be done with people you know. This is exactly the same reason, because if you continue to meet someone and you are in psychotherapeutic relation outside, then this is very intrusive, and this is like very, I mean, it's hard to keep boundaries and actually to create this kind of a safe space in which actual work can be done. So it's actually quite similar.
Yeah.
I am a little bit surprised by how similar it is. Yeah, but
I think it is, because that relation we really need to nurture and keep safe. And if we're talking in sense, keep safe, if we as the anthropologists are taking our ethics, and I'm saying these guidelines, they're really useful, actually, they really help. They're not rules, they're guidelines. But if we are really intending to do no harm as far as is possible, because it's not therapeutic relation, so we're not intending to do good either in that sense, we really need to maintain extremely strict boundaries, which is often seen as quite an old-fashioned approach, but we do, because those relations are ethnographic, and they should be, and that lack of singularity is a really huge problem. I mean, it's a huge problem. And then basically those relations, as I say, it sounds a bit harsh or perhaps a bit dramatic to say the relation is dead, but the minute it slipped into that, you can't use that relation as an ethnographic anymore, because you are going to really, in a sense, you possibly could really cause damage to that other, cause damage, it's not cause damage, but it's just not good to that other person. So yeah, I think there's a lot there which needs to be, and I think that would help with the notion of trust, if we're a bit more careful with our relations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanya, if I'm right, yes. Cool.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's very interesting, and I feel like I haven't had these conversations about the ethics of ethnography in quite a while, which is always a good conversation to be having. Just this point of sort of relationships and the slippages of between friendship and ethnographic subject interlocutor, we may call it. I think there's also a sort of a back and forth which needs to happen with interlocutors as you are starting to write up what you are actually saying, so that this blurriness of whether it's a friendship or not can actually be consensual throughout the publication process, which of course affects us as scientists, but I think we may agree here that we are not scientists in that sense. But in terms of this topic of sort of like anti-vaccination and raw milk drinking, which to me seem very separate in terms of the potential harms, I think there's something to be said also about the social construction of knowledge and how it moves throughout time. So it seems like there's also a class relationship here, as far as this diffusion of an anti-vaccination, whether we call it a discourse or sentiment or whatever else, which started with an upper class, at least as far as I can tell in the US, and then used to a population. And this sort of same cycle, we can, I think Foucault talks about this, but we can see this in breastfeeding as well, and many other things that become stigmatized the more they become ordinary. But on the other side of it, I think Bruno Latour actually sort of had this reckoning with the relationship of postmodernism in the social sciences and how it affected science. And I was wondering if you may have some sort of comments on that relationship that I think the social sciences have long had a difficult relationship with the STEM sciences, in that both see each other as something to criticize, but also something which seems like a serious threat to us, maybe. and maybe this sort of relationship coming back to building faith back in science is also a reckoning of what we may have done to destroy faith in science. So, sorry, a lot of comments there.
No, really helpful, really helpful. I will start with what you asked about the sort of relation between, say, the sciences, the different types. Bruno Latour for me is always a kind of guide in this. So his article, "The War of the Worlds," I don't know, the prickly pear little article, really good about the sort of different approaches to science, the different relations in science. He and also Viveros de Castro, I think, is where I would put how I kind of organize my thoughts, but that's definitely influenced, and the pair of them talk to each other about the perspectivalism. He's talking about this with related to human and animal relations, Viveros de Castro, but I think that I kind of organize my way of seeing. For me, these are just different ways of seeing the world. I don't want to be sort of make it we'll hold hands and sing, but it really are. They're different ways of seeing the world, and yeah, we're going to have different opinions, and we're going to have different ways of thinking about the world, and that's fine. That's good, because that difference is actually what's going to keep us talking. When everyone agrees, we had last week with colleagues from. For those of you who are there, with the Archipelago of the Living, one very, I would say, esteemed biologist saying, it's when there's no discussion that there's the trouble. We've got to, but we just don't need to, we need to kind of, now it sounds like a manifesto, but not being threatened by our interests, that somebody's difference is making, because we've got the threats, and we've got a very real threat. We can't romanticize it. Social sciences and humanities and STEM subjects are obviously, we can see from all sorts of measurements that social sciences, humanities often get slightly left off the table. So we've got to prove our usefulness, I think. I don't think, and this is okay, I know my personal opinion, perhaps the postmodern turn has helped so much in that proving that we need to, that's why I like Latour, because I think he's got some very good sort of ideas about how we move forwards. But again, this what we've been doing in this conversations with the Archipelago of the Living, these are people from all sorts of different disciplinary backgrounds, and the conversations are flowing, and they're flowing. And I think the reason why the conversations are flowing is because when they've been set up in a way that there's not that conflict of personal interest. And one of the foci, which I think is really important, is that we're focusing on problems that are in the, let's say, field. So we're looking at issues from all our disciplinary perspectives on an issue which is present, which people themselves have. So we're looking at it in that sense. So it's a problem, it's this collaborative research. That seems to me the way forwards. I don't think, yes, there's always going to be conflicts of opinions, and then there's hierarchies, and somebody says our science is more important than yours and you want to be like us. And we've had all of those horrible hoaxes, like in social text with proving that all this stuff. I hope that's kind of behind, that we've got through that in the sense, I mean, I know that there are still huge pockets of it. But even if there's just 10 or 15 of us talking about it, then we're moving forwards. In that sense, in a collaborative sense. And I think that the natural sciences, people who I know who are working in the natural sciences, let's say natural sciences, who I've met, are really open actually to these conversations. But we need to explain ourselves a little better, because I spoke with one person who is a cytologist, because of bacteria, and we're talking about social lives of bacteria. They have social lives, very good ones. And we were talking about their behavior, and it's very, very hard to find a shared language because we're coming from our conceptual background, they're from theirs. And we need a lot of time to do that. There really needs to be a lot of time. And that's one thing I think that none of us really have, is to actually be able to really sit down and exchange those ideas, because you really need to build up. And this work in the archipelagos of the living is giving us a space where we're actually able to speak and develop ideas together. So I think the War of the Worlds, as Latour would say, the science wars, hopefully are a bit better now. It's a bit better. So, but I think that, yeah, it sounds a bit sort of fluffy to say, oh, dialogue, but I think we really need to exchange ideas and get rid of any hierarchical ideas that your science is better than mine, because that was just, I don't know why.
I was just sort of going to add to that, in terms of actually researching natural sciences, it seems like part of that problem, though, because even within our own relationship as researchers researching researchers, are these hierarchies of like, oh, this person is surely, you know, so qualified that I can't possibly understand this, and you know, it's possible. I wonder if there's always even a collegial relationship, or if it's reflective of most any ethnography that one can do, and surely there are differences. And please go on.
No, that yeah, it's a really good question. It's one I'd need to, yeah. I mean, when you go and do, I know from my personal experience, it's really awkward actually, because you go into a meeting and you've managed to meet someone who's, yes, an expert on my interest in milk production. You go in there, and this has happened on more than one occasion, so it's not just in one situation. And then you start talking about your work, and they start talking what you're interested in, and then they start talking about what they're interested in. Often because they're in the natural sciences, say more natural, they may have, very often I found, which was actually really, I don't know, I really was happy about that, that they have a kind of side project which is related to human, let's say, social relations, but it's not really in their field. So they do that more as a kind of hobby. So that's kind of really useful, because then they want to talk about that and you want to hear about that. So you start getting into that conversation, and then on more than a few cases, which was really for me, because of the sort of singularity, as the ethnographic relation, say, oh yes, but my colleague also is doing something similar. They phone them and say, oh, could you come? We've got a colleaguica, we've got a colleague here. And instantly we've gone into collegial way of relating. So that's a real issue, because we've already gone in, and as Boyer says, we don't ever get out of it. It's very difficult to get out of it, because it sounds really bizarre if I say to you, so what did you eat for breakfast today? Suddenly in the middle of a, I mean, that's not what an anthropologist would ask, but we go into the life of that person much more than just their working sphere. So yeah, I mean, definitely when you go there, you're like, oh, I'm so happy because I'm going to speak to this person who really is an expert on this area, and that's really helpful. But the biggest issue I found was really slipping into that framework of collegial way of relating. Because especially if you're working at the same university, I mean, you're in the same meetings together. You're maybe in the same, you've got shared interests, you've got shared teaching, you're doing similar things. You meet, say, after a day of work, and that person's had a bad day of teaching. And then you say, small talk, how was your day? Oh, and then instantly the conversation starts talking about, it's gone in the wrong direction. Which is where I think the psychotherapy sort of approach would be really helpful for anthropologists in that sense, because that's where you've actually got to rein in that conversation and not let the conversation go off in that direction. But that's something to think about. So I think it's a really practical issue in the sense of how we do that research. And I think the science wars are communication through text. But actually, and this is where the Zoom has really helped us to connect us a bit more, in the sense that we can actually now start to communicate with people from different places and faculties and sciences in that sense. So yeah, there's lots there to think about. But my feeling is that relation we need to think about much more. Because it's just, I mean, again, not going on to psychotherapy, but it's just when you get into the awareness of what's going on in the relation, is then you can actually try to refigure it in some way. Which is why actually this whole preparing for today was so helpful to me, because I was thinking about it and I hadn't given myself that space to think about it, about the problem actually we have in these relations that we have with people we're doing our research on.
Kevin? Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for the interesting talk. It brought a lot of things to mind, certainly. I recall being in Zagreb at the time of these large billboards of a politician having his finger dipped in some Siri Verhanye with the line "Myslíš li kawi ya" as like an anti-EU sentiment. And it reminds me of this kind of debate over not only authority as to whether or not these scientists have the authority, whether you should seek it out, but also coercion. And if it's up to you to seek out this authority or if it's imposed on you. And a similar debate happened afterwards with the EU regulating what marmalade actually needs to be in order to enter the common market, that it has to contain citrus and all these things like that. So also regarding your work connecting raw milk and vaccination, thinking how easily it could also be transposed onto debates on male circumcision, for example, where in the US it's treated as a very scientific discourse. This is the proper way to do this. And I always see reactions that, oh, this is actually pseudoscience. There's a reason the skin is there, the natural, you know, the raw versus the cooked, so to speak. But to continue this discussion on authority, I'm kind of surprised to hear that there's such an openness to this dialogue among some of the hard scientists, the STEM scientists that you've been speaking with, simply because I've heard some rather different tales, particularly from people who work with energy issues. States, people who do their research at national laboratories. And some of the discursive tactics that they've pointed out have been that if you get a group of nuclear experts together, for example, you end up with this kind of group think where obviously the solution to all energy problems is nuclear. And if you dare suggest otherwise, they will say, no, you're off track, and reroute the conversation to their expertise and dismiss all opposing viewpoints. And the same person who was doing this research, Laura Nader, was presenting her findings to this group of nuclear experts at a national laboratory. And they were horrified that she dared speak to them like they were normal people. And they called her, how can you talk to us like we're normal people? Also, why aren't there any numbers in your presentation? Why aren't there any charts and graphs? We're not so good with words and we have trouble following a conversation. So you really need to put in more numbers.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting what you say. Again, I think just looking at it from like a relational perspective, I'll give you one example, two examples. One of what you just said, like what Laura Nader was experiencing, was a few years ago. I was at a conference and so doing research, and one of the topics is obviously breastfeeding. And I was giving a paper about breastfeeding from an interspecies perspective. And one of the people on the panel, or two of them, they'd written an article in Nature, so very well received. I mean, lots of people read it, about how they were psychologists and they'd done a huge research or analysis on the literature review, where they were questioning the suggestion that children who are, or infants who are breastfed have a higher IQ later on in life, or they have higher IQs. And they were suggesting that perhaps the reason for this higher IQ that had been measured was because of the child's ability or infant's ability to actually breastfeed, which meant that they had higher motor skills, they were more developed motor skills. And this means, or they were suggesting that this could be the reason why they had a higher IQ, because they had more developed motor skills. So that was their argument, which goes against the grain of it being breastfeeding, breast milk being the thing that makes the children or presented as being more higher IQ. So it was a panel. Somebody else was talking about breastfeeding. So breastfeeding, I don't know, it's quite an innocuous. When I was at a conference on populism, you have police there because the speakers, some of them are endangered. So yeah, you expect the police perhaps at some, they give their presentation, there's police standing beside them. breastfeeding, you don't really expect that kind of situation. And it was an international conference. And I noticed that this, because we were sitting up, that there was this group of maybe 10, 15 people came in as a group, which was quite odd in the sense that it wasn't one or two or a few people. And they sat all together. And you could see that they didn't look very impressed. When these colleagues gave their presentation, it turned out that they were, some were pediatricians and others were doing research from a natural science perspective on the benefits of breast milk. It turned into, I've never experienced anything like it, it turned into such a row that the person who'd organized the panel actually, because it was in a hotel, asked for perhaps it would be a good idea to get security to come if the hotel had someone to come in, because it turned into such a row. So I'm not saying, and again, I was shocked because it was breastfeeding. We were talking about breastfeeding, which, okay, I know can stir up passions, but it wasn't expected. And it was because of, not the same as what you were saying, Laura Nader's saying, but it was because they were saying something that was kind of against the grain of what they were saying. So a bit like the nuclear scientist. And I wonder again whether that's because I, in my research, visited all these people individually. We didn't visit as a group. And I wonder if that again has it's a method. I mean, I'm not always going on that note, but perhaps would that person, if they're in there with their colleagues, I know that if I had my whole department with me, you're probably going to react and speak in a different way perhaps than you would if you were on your own, in the sense that you might be more willing to hear different ideas, or I mean, I don't know, but there is that, as you say, group think in the sense. So if you're going towards, because, and again, but that's again about the relations, the scientists, let's say natural scientists, it's always through someone. So I never emailed them on my own and said, oh, can I come and visit? Okay, yes, actually some, and they, you know, that was fine. But also it can be, especially if you're in the same university, then someone says, who you know, says, oh, could you speak with this person because she's got interest in that area? You sort of connect each other. And then you're going in because you're into that relation or into that conversation because they know that you are this person, and you go into the conversation. And in those conversations, people are really, really, I was really impressed. I remember impressed in the sense of their openness, because I was expecting that they would probably treat us like we were a bit, I don't know. I was, for example, another example, which is an example of the positive sense, with some microbiologists, with actually a student we were talking with, somebody who's incredibly busy. And they said, yes, we can meet you, but for 5 minutes, because we wanted to talk to them about a bacterial social life. So I was expecting that they would say, yes, they have some social life, and that would be it. That they were basically seeing us just pro forma. This person, when we got there, because this person is head of some various departments, really busy, said, in fact, the secretary said, you've got 5 minutes with her. So like, okay. After 5 minutes, the secretary came in, obviously, to try and like get us out. And she said, no, it's fine, actually. I think I've got more time for them. And she spoke with us for about 2 hours. Because we were talking about bacteria and diaspora, the diaspora of bacteria. And she was so open to talking about it. And I had expected that she would say, these strange social scientists, you kind of go in feeling a bit awkward because you feel perhaps sometimes they might see you as a sort of strange, you're strange. But they were really, really open to communicating. So yeah, both sides, but certainly when on those individual encounters, never had a problem. But I wonder if those conversations would have been the same if we'd been sitting as the entire department of that particular sphere. They may have been very different then. Our conversation now is I wonder how this presentation would go down in the Faculty of Medicine, for example. I mean, I'm not saying, I don't want to make any prejudice, not at Rijeka, anywhere. I mean, would it be received in the same way? So, and is that because the people are receiving it as a collective rather than a individual? I don't know. Those are, I mean, what you asked is a really, really good question.
Thank you. I was just, this is a extraordinarily interesting topic also from a sort of epistemological point of view. So I have like a million of additional questions, but I would just sort of focus on one. When I maybe missed but when you come to sort of the perspective on understanding of the anti-vaxxers and so forth, there is essentially talk about their reasons, right? There is this idea of a reason for doing whatever. But I sort of, it appeared to me that the reasons were mostly sort of psychological. I mean, is there a sort of a, how does the anthropological literature tackle this notion of reasons for a refusal? Is it basically sort of personal psychological reasons, or are there sort of a deeper sort of more sort of normative reasons in the sense of, as you were mentioning, this belonging to a group and this sort of a sense of some kind of, maybe the reasons that are sort of against the sort of institution of science that breeds distrust and so forth? Or can you just talk more about this notion of reason in this?
Yeah. Definitely. I think that according to Eliza Sobor, she's brilliant. She's written very good work about vaccination refusal and hesitation, as well as Jennifer Reich, who is a sociologist, and she's her book's got lots of awards, which I think is good. I mean, makes me very hopeful, because then these ideas that she's presenting, which could be seen as challenging in the sense that they kind of challenge perhaps, let's say, dogma, she is being well received. Jennifer Reich has a very interesting argument. Both of them are focusing on social context, so more than perhaps the individual personal inner reasons, less that focus and more on the context. I think just to go back a second, they are writing from a empathetic, they are not going into conflict with people who are vaccine refusers, although again they say that they vaccinate. So it's interesting how everyone has a need to say whether they do or don't. But they are both, I think, starting from a perspective, because the previous sort of line of literature was that these people, and I don't know how to put it in a finer way, but they were perhaps unstable mentally in some way. I mean, it's often presented as anti-vaxxer. If you have the anti-vaxxer image in your head, then it's somebody who's kind of out there somewhere. And they were trying to say, no, it's not that. We've got to look at the social context. So they're coming from a position themselves. So that's maybe why they don't focus on the personal individual. They want to look at the social. One thing that Jennifer Rice says, which is really interesting and important, is that we've got two different things totally going against each other. We have this idea of personalized medicine, personal choice, giving permission, all of these things, which is very individualized kind of approach to medicine. You've got to give all your choices, you've got to give all your permissions. And on the other side, vaccination particular is a sort of non-personal thing. So we're being pushed in one sense to take control of your health, and all the messages that people are getting is be responsible for your health, inform yourselves, all of this. And on the other hand, no, you just do this and don't think about it too much, you just do it. So she says that there's a conflict between those two approaches, which is an issue, because actually this individualized medicine is now, and personalized medicine is now becoming much more and more, this is the approach that they're taking. You have personal doctors, I know from colleagues, having a lot of work and training on patient communication in that sense. So this is one thing that she says. Eliza Sobor is talking about this belonging into a group. She says that if, for example, with Waldorf schools, which are specific, I mean, this is a particular type of educational establishment, she says that the more you refuse to vaccinate, the easier it becomes in a way, because it's further and further, you're entering into belonging into a sort of group dynamic. So it's difficult to be one and the other in that sense. And that's okay going into ideas of identity and other things. But I would say that most of what I've been reading, but then I've been looking at anthropological. So obviously if you go into psychological, that's much more about the individual, sort of some individual attitudes. anthropologists are, you know, they're not anthropologists, sociologists as well, have gone into a more looking at the social context, maybe in a wider way. So maybe me saying yes, it's a more social is just because of where I've been reading, rather than actually the body of literature is saying that it is. But I particularly think this, what Jennifer Reich is saying, is really important and interesting in that sense that people are being sort of take responsibility for health. We've all got to be responsibility now for our hand washing and all these things. And at the same time, we've got this thing which is basically, no, you don't have to think of it, we'll think for you about that. So that's creating what she says is quite a contrast in that sense, conflict.
Yeah, I was thinking more of that the sort of sociological and the sort of political and normative reasons would be much more interesting in this sense, as opposed to sort of purely reducing it to some kind of psychological, you know, some kind of empty distrust, or not. They don't want to sort of listen to the amount of evidence and so forth. This whole idea of, as you said, we do vaccinate without actually having sort of considerable epistemic reasons, in the sense that I read all the vaccination literature and I know everything about vaccination, and then I make a decision to sort of vaccinate. This is not how it works. So in this sense, it's sort of a double standard in this sense of some kind of epistemic responsibility on part of citizens. Sort of, it's just from the epistemological point of view, it's interesting maybe when it comes to sort of epistemic autonomy and who do you delegate this decision making to. Like, you don't have the necessary information, and you have enough sort of epistemic responsibility to say, I don't have enough information and knowledge about the subject, but I will delegate this towards somebody else. And from the perspective of sort of those that do vaccinate, this is supposedly the medical profession and so forth, experts, I don't know. But again, this, and from then maybe it would be interesting, but I'm just thinking sort of out loud, where does this delegation happens within the communities of anti-vaxxers? You know, how does, maybe this is a sort of a very, I don't know, from my perspective, maybe this was sort of something that came into my mind as an interesting sort of aspect.
I think, yeah, definitely. For me, when I was thinking about this, what really interests me is how we, let's say the knowledge, if we take the knowledge, I mean, people who are discussing not vaccinating are sharing knowledge, the texts, academic texts about vaccination. And it's how we basically, I mean, I always say in terms of vaccination, which is different from raw milk drinking, what I always have found fascinating about it is that as a parent, and I speak here now as a parent, and other people who don't vaccinate, we're all trying to protect our children. We're all doing the same thing, but we're just doing it in totally different ways. And that's really, so what's different? But I think then we need both perspectives. We need the social context, and we need the individual psychological, we're going to call it psychological, but we need both forms of information. We need all that information to be able to get really, I'm not talking about holistic picture in that sense, but I think we will get much more information then to see how those two different things work on each other, because it's a very individual decision. It's an incredibly individual, personal decision to decide that's how have I relied on scientific knowledge to enable to then allow somebody to do that in that sense, especially to your child. How do I mean, you've done something where you have relied on scientific knowledge in a sense, or somebody else's knowledge of scientific knowledge to allow to do that. I remember once, which is having some situation where I had to have what do you call a drip for rehydration, and I remember one of those anthropological moments as the nurse was about to put the drip in, and I've never had one in before, thinking, well, there's been a lot of talk about how this is all just a social construct as they're sticking a needle in, and it's like, maybe not the right time to start thinking about laboratory life and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, you just at that side, and that's what Christina said about that. And then there's a blank. There's a trust there. There has to be. There's an emotional, very emotional, individual, I would say, process going on at that particular moment. So I think we need to look at both, because we're either looking at one or the other. And I think actually what we need is both, or not both, but different perspectives on the same issue. And this, what you say, for me, would be really interesting now, and I think I've been thinking about this, is to see how people are basically not on do they or don't they, but how is scientific knowledge, what is their relation to scientific knowledge? In fact, that's where I would like to see. So what you're saying, so how is it that some people are using it in this way, and looking at those relations around how we respond and work with knowledge. I mean, if we're going to scientific knowledge in that sense, I think that would be really, really interesting.
Christina?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to reflect on your point about epistemic aspects of decision making there, because I remembered an article that came to me recently about wearing masks. So a person who is against wearing masks is sharing an academic article about some research that shows how your oxygen absorption drops after hours of wearing mask. So this is like a published article, and okay, this person is not he's not a scientist, and the way he is reading that article may be problematic, because there I could see some as a methodologist, I could see what could be, what are the flaws of the methodology, and what if this kind of a conclusion is a little bit exaggerated, and then it's the person who reads it took it out of the context, so exaggerated even more, but what I wanted to say is that there is a huge body of scientific knowledge of different quality around. So ordinary people do not know these criteria of which articles are more reliable, and cannot read these nuances there. So you can actually read into scientific literature a lot, so yeah, and this is a problem of how we disseminate and how we actually communicate as scientists with people who are not scientists, and how we communicate these ideas, because policy is one thing and the scientific evidence is the other, and it's never, you always have some contradictions there. You always have some contradicting evidence, and how people deal with this kind of contradiction, this is a very difficult question.
Yeah, and if I may say, just to add to that, science is a debate. So if we're presenting science as a given, then how we work together is to debate. We take that person's idea, we digest it, and then we add a little bit, or we slightly disagree, or we agree, but we're going forwards. If we say forwards, but it's a discussion. So if you're not in that background, if you're not doing that, then yeah, what piece of information are you sort of taking? Whose knowledge are you relying on? And as you say, I think again, I would first say, because I think that we, as people working in science in all our different forms and shapes, we need to think about how science works in that sense. Accessibility to knowledge. Science has become an extremely, I don't want to get into, because they were like, oh, she's from cultural studies, off they go again. Science is a extremely big business. And a lot of this knowledge is inaccessible, or it's accessible only through sort of underhand or different ways. So a lot of that knowledge is actually not accessible for people, and there's the way we exchange that knowledge or share it. We've got lots of now, for universities, popularization of science and sharing the knowledge. But even then, as you say, the different standards of knowledge, whose knowledge are we really relying on? And I remember also, I mean, this comes just from my own personal experience, before the famous MMR vaccination, which has caused so much discussion and debate, probably because I think most people, when they vaccinate their own child, is probably nervous because you're not quite sure. I mean, there's always possibility for reaction. I suddenly was like, oh, is this the right? I hadn't thought about it because I was like, oh, well, it's yes, okay. Sudden panic. Spoke to somebody who is her children. So she hadn't researched it for herself, or older. So the MMR at that point wasn't around. Said to her, oh, I'm in a panic. She said, okay, we'll meet. And she then, as somebody who works in that field and really knows, said, I went to go and look at the literature for the first time on anti-MMR. And she said, you cannot understand, if you read that, how its different articles are all cobbled together. Different flawed research. It was really interesting seeing her interpretation of this research, like what you're saying now about this with the masks, and you could see how the research was different. Let's say there were flaws in that research design, but if you're not in that, you can't. As an anthropologist, there's no way I can say that an article about a validity of a vaccine is, I can't judge if this is good science or bad, because it's just not, I don't have that field of expertise. But that's again because a lot of this research on vaccination or vaccine hesitation is saying that we don't need, and this is interesting, to try and fill people with knowledge to explain it better. That we've got to go further. And I think what's absent in most of this is that we need to actually start to look at how we are functioning as science, actually. Because I think that's where the trust maybe is, the question of trust is coming, like people are questioning what we're doing. And I think very often with reason, because as I say, I don't want to get too deep into that, but science, there's a lot of money flowing in and out of science. And there are interests there, which we have to address. We really have to address. And we have to address in a way that's going to make ourselves feel very uncomfortable, I think. Not to make ourselves feel uncomfortable for the sake of feeling uncomfortable, but it's difficult if people think that you're not being honest with yourselves to then trust what you're saying. At least I would say. So I think, yeah, it is looking at the knowledge and how it's disseminated, but I think it's also very much looking at how it's produced, where it's being produced.
I think sort of on this topic of the slide that we have right now is the research and why do people vaccinate and why people don't vaccinate, or I can't see on the other side. I think one of the strengths of ethnography is actually to not answer why. I've always been very uncomfortable with answering a question of why, but how, what are the processes that we develop, and how do people come to believe things in either direction? And I think that that's also a question that should be applied to the sciences themselves as well.
Yeah, I think because that with Christina, what you've just said as well, maybe in a sense, but again, when you think about that, I was just in terms of in a second with breastfeeding, but is actually to see how that knowledge is being disseminated, that we follow how people are disseminating it, how people are using these articles, but also how scientific knowledge is being disseminated to, let's say, worried parents or concerned parents. One issue there, again, is a really sort of practical issue, is access, ethnographic access. For breastfeeding, we really tried to get access, and we did get access to a point, but we kept having to go through these ethics committees at different parts of, this was in this county in Primorsko-Goranska, different ethics committees. You would get to a certain point of access to speak with people who are explaining, pediatricians, and then suddenly we're like, no, we need to go through another ethics committee at the main health board because, oh, you've gone into another area of information. And you got the impression that people were saying yes, but basically saying no in terms of access to. It's very difficult to actually get access to watch. I mean, it would be really, really good, but I don't know, in this context, maybe in other social contexts, is to actually, I know Jennifer Reich, she went to conferences about vaccination, but to actually be with pediatrician and patients and see how that negotiation's going on. But the actual way of doing that is really, really challenging, because you would need to get so many different permissions from so many different people. And I tried with one colleague to get for but to talk with medical professionals and parents about breastfeeding in the medical context. And that, as I say, yes, it was yes, and then, oh, we'll have to go through another ethics board. So yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge. I mean, that's another thing we have to think about is our research. I mean, how, you know, is how we actually are able to do it. We're often in a short time frame, and if you've got 10 ethics committee meetings to go to, or you can just go and speak to someone instantly, you're probably going to go in that direction because of just so many different pressures. But yeah.
Yeah, sure.
A little off track here, but I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier about looking not exclusively at social media, but also taking radio into consideration. I admit having something of an unhealthy habit of listening to American right wing and even British LBC, Nick Ferrari, Nigel.
Wow.
I'm really curious what drew you to that and how you incorporate it into your work.
Well, it was just because I was looking, I was looking at the literature, which they were talking about. A lot of literature on science-related populism, or different ways of terming it, were referring to this article. I'll go back to Laurette and, Sauret, and Gunster, where they've done a really, I can share the reference. They did a really good, or written a really good article about AOL, Canadian right-wing talk show. And that's where, and it really struck me then at that point, that they said that, and they wrote this in 2011, so that's some time ago, but we were quite often focusing on social media and research. Social media, especially in the writing of vaccination, is seen as the catalyst for all the space where these debates and discussions are happening. It's happening on social media, and they particularly, some authors, Kata does research on Facebook. But they were saying that actually the radio is really important, and it's seen as kind of, well, not old-fashioned, but it's not so researched. It's not an area which people research. And then after I read that article, I was sort of walking about, and actually the radio is on everywhere. In the car, you put on the radio, maybe in a shop, in the doctor's waiting room, not perhaps doctor's waiting, but in different places, the radio, and people listen now, especially podcasts. People, okay, so that's like different, but people are listening to the radio. They have the radio on. And yeah, suddenly realized, yes, actually, but we do focus a lot on social media and how important it is, but actually the radio is something that's much more accessible also to many people. It's more accessible than this has got generational and class and different, you know, sort of restrictions on it in the sense of the internet and surfing the internet, whereas the radio is something that many different generations and people are listening to. So yeah, I mean, it was a sort of epiphany for me in that sense, because I'd always sort of thought about social media and not so much about radio as an important place where these discussions, okay, people are phoning in and there's not maybe such a direct discussion as there is on social media, but all those conversations that people are listening to and having, and their research is talking about this, about what they call, I don't know if it's their term, I can't remember, maybe not, but argutainment. So this idea of arguing, yeah, really interesting article. And lots of people who are writing about science-related populism or something to do with the role of science in populist narratives rely on that article, it seems to me, which is how I got there. So I didn't have a sort of like, oh, I'll go to radio or something, but it was just they turned on the light bulb.
I'll just add that I read something a while back by Gramsci about the kind of discussion that happens between experts and common sense, really, where someone will get into an argument over an issue and could be soundly defeated in the argument, but they'll walk away with their opinions completely unchanged because they imagine, oh, well, I don't argue very well, but if such a person was here who could argue better, they would have easily defeated that person. And I think part of the appeal of talk radio is precisely you tune into the host who makes the arguments that you already believe in, that you can't make yourself, and you wait for people to call in and watch them easily get dismissed by the host who has a kind of discursive authority at that moment, being able to shut them off and completely control the debate.
Yeah, it's really, we did talk about this in the article about how the guests, and because they're it's somebody who is kind of has the talk show host, Adler, I think he's called, is dismissive of, let's say, the academic elite. He's bringing in guests who are epitome of common sense. They're often common sense experiences, and he's controlling the whole show in the sense that they're dismissing what the academic arguments are through their common sense, and done in a pretty kind of not aggressive, but it's a combative tone in that sense. So yeah, I think we can just as you were talking this about somebody going through something and not changing their opinion at all. I don't want to get too political, but when I see the President of the United States has returned back to the White House and whipped off his mask, it's like nothing has changed there. So absolutely, I think, and that's really in that exchange, the exchange of these ideas, how we set up those exchanges. So that idea of how we disseminate knowledge is so important, and the way that we set up those relations to disseminate knowledge is what's so important in that sense. And that's where I think we need to ask, just to go back to that screen about the analytical relation, is if we set ourselves up as an us and them relation straight away from asking the bad question of why, then that dissemination, the way that knowledge is or exchange is already set up. We've already set up the exchange, and we've set it up through our question and through our research methods, basically. We've set up that analytical relation from the very outset, and it's then incredibly difficult to get out of that relation, or that form of relation, I think. So I think it's really important that we think about what it is that we're doing. What's our motivation for this? Is it to be activists? Okay, fine. I mean, the literature, as I'm sure you know, on engaged anthropology says it's a spectrum, and we can all be where we feel comfortable, but we just need to say, okay, this is a form of academic activism, so it's clear to everyone. Because when we're presenting it, we're in a way relating, in a sense that we're relating like activists, and then saying, but we know best. That's going to cause all sorts of problems with the person with whom you're in that relation. And that again is going back to trust, because, well, you're saying one thing and doing something quite different. So I think that's also important.
Thank you very much. I think it is time for us to wrap it up slowly. Thank you very much for this. We could, and I hope we'll have a chance to sort of continue this discussion, maybe even live at some point. And thank you for sharing your research with us, Sarah. And hope to continue the discussion, and of course looking forward to your book on milk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you really very much, everyone, for your time and for listening and for asking and commenting. It's really helpful. It's an area which is, as I say, is something I've been thinking about, and it's been bothering me for a very long time. So it's been really helpful to have this opportunity to think about it. So really, thank you really very much for that.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and thank you, Sarah, for letting us think aloud with you about this subject.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
And to you all.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.